The night had grown still again, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. Alina's heart still beat erratically, not from fear this time, but from the realization that she had done something she thought impossible. She had controlled her power. The surge of energy that had once terrified her was now something she had wielded, and it had saved both her and Luca's lives. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a creeping exhaustion overtook her. She sagged into Luca's arms, her body trembling. He held her tight, his strong presence grounding her amidst the chaos that still lingered in the air. "We need to keep moving," Luca said softly, pulling her gently from the embrace. His eyes searched hers, filled with admiration but also with the seriousness of the situation. "They'll come back, and they won't stop until they've captured or killed you." Alina nodded, though her body ached and her mind swam with fatigue. She had bought them time, but Luca was right, the hunters wouldn't give up. They'd regroup, reassess, and come at them with even more determination. The power she had unleashed might not be enough next time. Luca's hand slipped into hers, a subtle reminder that she wasn't alone. "There's a safe house not far from here," he said. "We can rest there, gather supplies, and figure out our next move." She nodded again, too tired to argue, but there was a gnawing feeling in her chest. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked quietly as they began walking through the dense forest, their steps careful and quiet. Luca glanced at her, his face unreadable. "Since I first tracked you," he admitted. "The moment I saw what you were, I knew I couldn't kill you." His words caught her off guard. "You knew I wasn't human?" He sighed, his gaze turning forward again as they trudged along a narrow path. "Not right away. At first, you were just another target, another name on my list. But when I saw you up close, saw the way you were fighting, not just for your life, but against yourself, I realized you weren't like the others." Alina swallowed hard. She didn't know whether to feel comforted or more fearful. "So you were sent to kill me, but you changed your mind?" Luca stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "I was sent to kill anyone like you, but you're not a monster. Alina, you've been hunted for something you didn't choose, something you've struggled to control. That's why I couldn't carry out my mission." Her heart swelled at his words, but a shadow of doubt still lingered. "What makes you think they won't send someone else?" she asked. "What makes you think they'll stop coming for me?" "They won't stop," he said, his voice steady but grim. "But I'm not going to let them get to you." Alina stared at him, searching his face for some sign of hesitation, some flicker of doubt, but there was none. Luca was determined, fiercely so. She didn't know why he had chosen to protect her, but she couldn't deny the relief she felt knowing he was by her side. They continued their journey in silence, the forest growing darker as the night deepened. The moonlight that had once guided them now faded behind thick clouds, leaving them to navigate by instinct. Alina's body screamed for rest, but she pushed forward, trusting Luca to lead them to safety. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the forest, where a small cabin stood hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, overgrown with vines and surrounded by moss-covered stones. Luca approached cautiously, checking the perimeter before motioning for Alina to follow. Inside, the cabin was sparse but functional. A small fireplace sat in one corner, a few wooden chairs scattered around, and a single bed pushed against the far wall. Luca wasted no time in lighting a fire, the warm glow illuminating the small space and casting flickering shadows across the walls. "You can rest here," Luca said, his voice soft but firm. "We'll be safe for a while." Alina nodded, though the tension in her body remained. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind still racing despite the overwhelming exhaustion. Everything had changed so quickly, her power, Luca's protection, the hunters. It was too much to process all at once. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. "You barely know me, yet you're risking everything." Luca paused, his back to her as he tended to the fire, his shoulders tensed, and for a moment, she thought he might not answer, but then he turned to face her, his expression conflicted. "I've spent my whole life following orders," he said, his voice low. "I've hunted people like you, people who were deemed dangerous just because they were different. But the more I did it, the more I questioned everything. It wasn't until I met you that I realized how wrong it all was." Alina's chest tightened. "And now?" "And now," he said, taking a deep breath, "I'm done following orders. I'm done being their weapon." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Alina knew the cost of defying the hunters. Luca had not only spared her life but had also put his own at risk. He was a traitor in their eyes now, just like her. "What happens when they find us again?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Luca crossed the room and knelt in front of her, his hand resting gently on her knee. "We fight," he said simply, "and this time, we fight together." Alina looked into his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. She had been running for so long, hiding from the hunters, from herself, but now, with Luca by her side, she didn't feel so alone. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. Alina's eyes grew heavy, the warmth of the fire and the exhaustion of the day finally catching up with her. Luca stood and grabbed a blanket, draping it over her shoulders. "Get some rest," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." She nodded, too tired to argue, and lay down on the bed. As her eyes fluttered shut, she felt a strange sense of peace, despite the danger that still loomed over them. Luca's presence was a comfort she hadn't expected, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to relax. But as sleep began to claim her, a nagging thought crept into her mind. The hunters wouldn't give up. They would come for her again, and when they did, it wouldn't just be her life on the line. Luca was now a target too, and that scared her more than anything. She couldn't afford to lose him. Not now. Not ever. Hours later, Alina woke with a start, the faintest sound stirring her from sleep. Her heart raced as she sat up, her senses on high alert. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in a soft, dim glow. Luca was standing by the window, his body tense, his hand gripping the hilt of his dagger. "Luca?" Alina whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "What is it?" His eyes were fixed on something outside, his expression dark. "They've found us," he said quietly, his voice tight with tension. "They're here." Alina's heart dropped, her body going cold with dread. She scrambled out of bed, her mind racing. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. The hunters were here. And this time, there would be no running. They had to fight. Alina's heart thundered in her chest, her pulse so loud it seemed to drown out everything else around her. She could see the shadows outside the window, barely discernible through the thick fog of the night. The hunters had found them, and this time, they were too close. The dread that had simmered inside her now boiled over. "They're surrounding the cabin," Luca said quietly, his voice barely audible. His eyes never left the window, his body tense, every muscle coiled and ready for action. Alina's throat tightened. She had faced danger before, but this was different. This time, there was no escape route, no running into the unknown to buy time. They were cornered, and it was only a matter of moments before the hunters stormed in. "How many?" she whispered, standing beside Luca, her breath shallow as she peered through the window into the darkness. "5, maybe more," he replied, his jaw clenched. "They'll come through the door and windows at the same time, try to overwhelm us." Alina's palms were slick with sweat as she struggled to control her breathing. She could feel her power stirring beneath the surface, restless and raw, eager to be unleashed. But the fear of losing control gnawed at her, threatening to unravel everything she had fought so hard to hold together. Luca turned to her, his eyes dark and serious. "We don't have much time. When they come, you'll need to use your power." Alina shook her head, panic creeping into her voice. "I don't know if I can. What if I hurt you?" Luca placed his hands on her shoulders, grounding her, his touch firm but comforting. "You won't," he said with quiet certainty. "You're stronger than you think. Alina, you've already proven that." She met his gaze, her chest tightening with the weight of his words. He believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. And now, with the hunters closing in, she realized that she couldn't afford to doubt herself anymore. Luca was right, she was strong. She had to be. "We're in this together," he said softly, his hand slipping from her shoulder to grasp her hand. "But we need to trust each other. Do you trust me?" Alina swallowed hard, the fear and adrenaline crashing together inside her like a storm. She nodded, her grip tightening on his hand. "I trust you." Luca gave a single, sharp nod before stepping back toward the center of the cabin. He crouched low, unsheathing his dagger as he prepared for the inevitable breach. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, as they both listened to the hunters moving outside. Then, without warning, the door burst open with a deafening crash. A rush of cold air filled the cabin as the first hunter barreled through, his figure nothing more than a blur in the chaos. Luca moved swiftly, meeting the attacker head-on, his dagger flashing in the dim light as steel met steel. The clash of weapons echoed through the small space, but Alina barely registered it. The others were coming. More hunters appeared at the windows, smashing through the glass with brute force, their movements swift and deadly. Alina's heart raced as panic threatened to overtake her. Luca was fighting valiantly, his skills honed through years of training, but they were outnumbered. One of the hunters lunged at her, and instinctively, Alina raised her hands, releasing a surge of energy that sent him flying back into the wall with a sickening thud. The power crackled through her veins, wild and fierce, but this time, she didn't shy away from it. Another hunter rushed at her, and she spun around, letting the energy pulse through her fingertips. A wave of light erupted from her hands, knocking the hunter off his feet and sending him crashing to the ground. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, but for the first time, she felt in control. The power was hers to command, not the other way around. Luca was fending off two attackers at once, his movements precise and lethal, but he was struggling. Alina's chest tightened as she saw one of the hunters land a blow, slashing across Luca's arm. He stumbled back, blood dripping from the wound, but he didn't falter. Without thinking, Alina surged forward, her power flaring to life once more. She released another wave of energy, striking both hunters simultaneously. They crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The room fell silent, the echoes of the battle still ringing in her ears. Alina stood there, her chest heaving, her body trembling from the exertion. The cabin was littered with broken glass and the bodies of the hunters, their forms still and lifeless. Luca wiped the blood from his arm, wincing as he stood up. His eyes met Alina's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over them like a heavy blanket. "You did it," Luca said quietly, his voice filled with awe. Alina blinked, her mind still reeling from the intensity of the fight. She looked down at her hands, the faint glow of energy still lingering at her fingertips. She had done it, she had controlled her power, and she hadn't hurt him. But before she could fully process the victory, Luca's expression darkened. "There's more coming," he said, his voice urgent. "We need to go, now." Alina's heart sank. Of course, it wasn't over. The hunters would never stop. No matter how many they fought, there would always be more. But she wasn't the same person she had been before. She wasn't running anymore. "We can't keep running," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "We have to stop this." Luca stared at her, his brow furrowed. "What are you saying?" Alina took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm saying we need to end this. We can't keep fighting them off forever. We need to take the fight to them." Luca's eyes widened, surprise flickering across his face. "You want to go after them?" Alina nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. "Yes, I'm done hiding. I'm done being hunted. If we're going to survive, we need to stop them at the source." Luca studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're right, it's time we fought back." Alina felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge of what lay ahead. They were about to go up against an organization that had hunted people like her for generations. It wouldn't be easy, it wouldn't be safe. But it was the only way. "Do you know where they are?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. Luca nodded grimly. "I do, but it's heavily guarded. We'll need a plan." Alina nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. They had no allies, no backup, but they had each other, and for the first time in her life, she felt like that might just be enough. "We'll figure it out," she said, determination hardening her voice. "We'll make a plan." Luca's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "Then let's end this." They gathered what little supplies they had, preparing for the journey ahead. The cabin, once their sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The air was thick with tension, but beneath it all was a simmering hope. Alina glanced at Luca as they stepped outside into the cold night air, the moon casting an eerie glow over the forest. "Where do we start?" Luca's eyes narrowed as he looked toward the distant horizon. "We start by taking down the people who created me." Alina's breath caught in her throat. The people who had trained Luca, the very ones who had sent him after her, those were the people they were going after. And this time, she wouldn't be running. She would be fighting.